Welcome to another episode of Crypto Capsule Commentary, where I answer some of the questions I get from all of you around the world every week. Hope you're ready, because here we go. This episode is brought to you by Q9 Capital, a platform I personally use. Q9 are bringing a private wealth experience and one of the broadest product sets in crypto direct to young professionals, high net worth investors, wealth managers, and corporates. They're offering free cold storage to all new clients and a 2,000 USDC trading bonus. Check out the link above for more details. Today, the question we're going to answer is one that I've gotten from many of you around the world. It goes always something around like this. Henri, I've been hearing a big debate regarding the environmental impact of Bitcoin. Is it as bad as people say, or actually is it exaggerated? So this is a question I've been getting a lot, and actually like any of these big controversial topics, it's very important that you look at both sides of the debate, and then actually with those facts, you make your own decision. So actually, let's start with the environmental impact, and it's absolutely correct. The Bitcoin mining, many would argue is not a green asset. And there's really three things that a lot of the environment when they look at Bitcoin mining. First of all is electricity consumption. Second is carbon footprint. And number three is electronic waste. Let's tackle them one by one. When it comes to the electricity consumption, it is true that the Bitcoin mining, the process of coming up with a new block every 10 minutes, consumes a lot of electricity. To put things in perspective, the network, depending on the data source that you look at, consumes anywhere between 75 to 100 terawatt hour, which is pretty much as much the electricity as the entire country of Norway or Ukraine. To put it at the transaction level, if I would send you a Bitcoin, one transaction, it consumes, according to some sources, as much electricity as the average US household consumes in about 25 days. So that's puts things in perspective when it comes to electricity consumption. Second is a carbon footprint, which is basically the total amount of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, that are actually kind of emitted indirectly or directly by the Bitcoin network. And then again, depending on the various sources you look at, the Bitcoin network emits around 40 metric tons of CO2, which is pretty much similar to what the country like Ecuador, for example, emits. And again, this is something, an argument you'll hear a lot. A lot of people will tell you that one Bitcoin transaction is the equivalent to 800,000 Visa transactions. But as I tell you in a couple of seconds, that's probably not a very fair comparison. And number three, what people look at is really what we call electronic waste. One reality is when you're mining Bitcoin, those mining machines that you're using have generally a lifespan of about 18 months, give or take. And these machines are specialized for Bitcoin mining. So actually when they're not useful anymore, it's not as if you can use them for anything else, and they basically go to waste. To put things in perspective, it is estimated now that the entire Bitcoin network now, with its Bitcoin machines, consumes around 10.7, around about 10 kilotons of electronic waste, which is pretty similar to what the country like Luxembourg consumes, for example. And every time you're making a transfer, it's basically like if I send you a Bitcoin, it's equivalent of 100 grams of electronic waste, a bit like throwing a little battery every time in the garbage. So this is obviously the arguments a lot of the environmentalists have been using. However, I think it's very important we look at the other side of the spectrum as well of this debate. First of all, I think it's important to understand, yes, right now the Bitcoin network and many other cryptocurrencies operate on what we call proof of work, which is basically this is the electricity consuming consensus mechanism. The good news now here is that a lot of actually cryptocurrencies, Ethereum is a good example, are moving to proof of stake, which consumes really a fraction of the electricity that proof of work consumes. And also, to be fair, is while there's electricity consumption, whenever transactions are being done, each time a block is being mined, actually the whole process of holding Bitcoin does not consume electricity from that perspective. Second thing is actually this argument that I mentioned that many people will say, one Bitcoin transaction is like 800,000 Visa transactions. And I would argue that is actually probably not a fair comparison. Obviously the Visa network, or pretty much any credit card network, is centralized. And one thing that I've discussed this previously in my newsletter is what we call the impossible trinity, or the blockchain trilemma, which is in any kind of ecosystem, any blockchain ecosystem, you can never have security, scalability, and decentralization at the same time. You can have security and scalability, but you won't have decentralization. You can have something that is decentralized and that is secure, but then it will not be scalable, a bit like the Bitcoin network, for example. So I think when we look at these comparisons, we really have to keep in mind that Bitcoin is a decentralized network. And because of that, actually one of the downsides that actually it consumes a lot of electricity for the consensus mechanism. The other thing, by the way, it's often people, instead of comparing with the Visa network, probably we should compare it with gold, especially now that I think pretty much everybody acknowledges now that Bitcoin is kind of a digital gold. So I think a fair comparison is to look at what is the electricity consumption of gold. And here again, depending on the data search you look at, it is reported that actually gold mining, like traditional gold mining, it consumes is potentially 50 times, 50, more polluting than actually Bitcoin mining. And actually, just put things in perspective, the wedding band, I don't have one myself, but I'd say the normal gold ring is responsible for about 20 tons of waste. So these are often things that we don't think about. We're all used to traditional gold, but obviously there's a big focus on Bitcoin mining. And again, to put things in perspective, it is estimated that traditional gold mining consumes about 130 terawatt hours of electricity. So they very interesting from that perspective. Even the World Gold Council acknowledge that in order for the gold industry, the traditional industry, to meet the Paris Climate Agreement targets, the consumption needs to be reduced by 80% by 2050. So I think this is just to put things in perspective. I think it's a fair comparison when we're looking at Bitcoin mining to compare it with gold. And by the way, not that it's a good comparison in the sense that gold is actually very polluting, but I think it really helps to put things in perspective. Number 3 is really where the source of electricity is coming from. One thing that is interesting when you look at the data right now, again, depending on which source of data you look at, it's anywhere from 56 to about 73% of the electricity consumed by Bitcoin mining comes from renewables. Again, which is interesting from that perspective, whether it's hydropower or other sources. So it's not necessarily the big polluting coal plants, but really something that is more coming from renewables, which obviously is better from an environmental perspective. And the other argument that many people in the crypto community will say is actually a lot of these Bitcoin miners are consuming electricity that would otherwise be wasted. You know, a lot of these Bitcoin farms or Bitcoin mine farms are actually next to where the electricity is produced. Often they're next to dams or areas where, for example, in certain areas, at the time of the day, for example, at night, where there's less demand on electricity, these Bitcoin mining machines are running 24/7. So they kind of take the electricity that is kind of in excess or would be otherwise wasted. And the other thing as well, because they're so close to the source of electricity, there's a lot of actually slippage of electricity from the time that electricity is produced at a dam all the way it reaches your house. These guys are able to capture some of this electricity that is kind of, that would be otherwise wasted. And maybe the last argument that many in the crypto ecosystem would make, which I think is, again, not a fair one, but I think it's worth mentioning, is actually the question of size. I was mentioning at the beginning that the electricity consumption of the Bitcoin network is pretty much similar to Ukraine. So Ukraine has a GDP of $150 billion more or less a year. The Bitcoin network has a market cap number over $1 trillion. Again, obviously GDP and market cap are not probably exact comparisons, but again, it shows that actually the Bitcoin network now is multiple times bigger than, for example, GDP of a country is being compared with. So I think all these things help put things in perspective. So really, to wrap it up, when you look at really the facts and the arguments on both sides, I think that the real situations is not really potentially as bad as many people are saying, but it's not as green as a lot of the crypto enthusiasts want to mention either. And the reality is probably somewhere in between. And this actually, hopefully now this was helpful, because with this information, you can make your own decision on what you believe is the real environmental impact of Bitcoin and actually where the real answer stands from that perspective. Personally, the way I look at it myself, I think that, obviously there's been Bitcoin mining is not necessarily a green thing. However, to be fair, I think the reality on the ground is less worse than what many people will say. And second is actually because there's so much focus and so much renewables are being used, it actually, again, it's not as bad from that perspective. And third, probably from my personal perspective, is that why do we have Bitcoin mining? Because for the first time, we're able to have a way that is decentralized. And many would argue that this is a kind of a price to pay to have an asset that is decentralized. I mean, if you live in a country yourself where you have a good central bank, you're not worried about hyperinflation, inflation even to a certain extent, or you trust your central bank, then great, that's great. And maybe you don't need the decentralized nature of Bitcoin. However, I'm sure many of our viewers who are in Lebanon, who are in Zimbabwe, who are in Turkey right now, where literally, not only in many cases they cannot take away their money from banks, or actually there's hyperinflation in the country. Probably if in those cases, they're actually happy to pay that electricity price or that environmental footprint in order to have an asset that is a store of value that is beyond the control of the government or some of the hyperinflation elements that we're seeing. Hope this was useful. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time for another episode of Crypto Capsule Commentary.